Welcome to the Power of One. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with a researcher, Dr. Robinson, and we're going to speak about a very sensitive topic today. We're going to speak about poverty. Welcome to the show, Dr. Robinson.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Robinson, give the viewers a little background of yourself.
Sure. I'm trained as a developmental and community psychologist. I've done work over the past 30 years across the country, and the real focus of my work is community well-being. I am very interested in what it takes to actually build an ecosystem where everyone's outcomes are improved. I do believe that we know enough from the research to actually point us in this direction. So I've had the pleasure of working for a number of years in the public health arena. I've worked in philanthropy at the Pew Charitable Trust, at Philanthropy Network of Greater Philadelphia. I've had the pleasure of working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, but also I have an academic appointment. I work at the Carsey School of Public Policy at University of New Hampshire. So I'm kind of all over the place, but I'm thrilled to be with you today.
Thank you so much. Let's talk about the importance of poverty, the language, concepts, and understanding of it.
Well, I wanted to start a little bit by talking about three main characteristics of poverty. And it's really important for me to say some of this is my thinking, but I have been heavily influenced by a number of researchers. I'm a lifelong learner and an avid reader. So the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, James Adams, Eddie Glaude, Dr. David Williams, Isabella Wilkerson, Kathy Eden, Matthew Desmond, Derek Hamilton, they all influence my work. And I want to start off first by saying that there are a lot of dimensions to poverty. People think a lot about material hardship, but there's also human frailty, folks who have disabilities and the wear and tear poverty has on the human body, generational trauma, particularly for people of color, for immigrants, refugees, folks who have been historically oppressed. You look at family and neighborhood violence and the implication that that has had and continues to have generationally on poverty. Unfortunately, in America, there's a poverty of place. There are places where environmentally, inadequate water, inadequate sewage, they are actually known as zones, death zones, because the death rates are so high, broken institutions in those areas, as well as policies. So all of that is part of the dimensions of poverty. In addition, poverty is relationships, it's relational. And so consequently, folks who are in a desert where they're not access, how do they get the links, or are they in the know about job opportunities, education opportunities, housing opportunities? And so there's this gap between those who are advantaged and those who have been historically marginalized. And finally, and something that we talk about a lot today is this whole issue around poverty and how it aligns with equity and fairness and justice. It's not just economics. There's an injustice to folks who are impoverished. So when we talk about poverty, I think it's really important for us to be really thoughtful about what it really is.
How is poverty measured and defined? Because as you're indicating, it's not the same across the board.
It's not. And I want to, now I'm going to be really quick, but I want to just briefly talk about how we ended up here, because the poverty rate in the United States has been almost exactly the same in comparison for the last 50 years. It really hasn't changed, meaning the number of people who are in poverty and their status has remained static. Now, certainly all of us are making more money than we did 50 years ago and are living in different circumstances. But it is though all of us continue to move forward at the same pace. It is not unusual for folks who are in poverty, for example, to have a cell phone at this point in time. But just because you have a cell phone, frankly doesn't mean that you have enough food to eat, that you have enough heat, that you have adequate housing. And so some of these notions about what poverty is, I think is really important. I want to start by saying that there's a narrative, and part of this is based on the founding of this country, a country that was founded, frankly, on poverty. You had the extermination of Native Indigenous folks and the enslavement of Africans. So from the beginning of America, there were the haves and the have not. And that was put into policy. The way that we look at the poor and the way that we look at the impoverished, and a lot of it, as I talk about policy, it is something that has been done to groups of people historically. So if we really want to talk about poverty measures, some of it is systemic, and we really have to look at that. Getting to your question, the thinking historically was that being hungry incentivizes work. And so if you're hungry, you're going to get a job. It keeps wages low if that is your, kind of thinking in general. And as we started to think about the poor, and Dickens was really the one in his work. Here we are at the end of the holiday season. Many of you know the Christmas Carol. Dickens wrote a lot about the conditions of people in poverty. And in England started with poor laws that forbid begging. So we started to all of a sudden look at the poor as being human, because historically there had been this dehumanization of the poor. So the poverty rate in the US was actually defined in the 1960s by a worker at the Social Security Administration. She was a researcher, and it's defined as 3 times the minimal food budget. That definition was established in 1963. Unfortunately, it has not changed. And there are real problems in the definition. It doesn't include housing, heat, electricity, any utilities. You just take the minimum budget that one needs to buy food, you multiply it times 3, and then you multiply it times the number of the people in the household. So, for example, if you have a mother with 4 children, of course, the rate for that poverty would be different than for a single individual. Congress is asked to have this looked at. National Academy of Sciences, a whole host of other folks. It's really a problem, but it is the standard that the federal government uses to measure poverty. And it is tested, it differentiates across the country. So, for example, as you would expect, the poverty rate in Mississippi is different than the poverty rate in Philadelphia, but there are federal policy standards that are equalizers, and certain elements and certain policies, it doesn't really matter. There's a federal policy standard, and some means tested programs you cannot qualify if you're above that federal level.
How do we get to that point of poverty? So COVID played a major part in the prices that we're now faced with today. Going to the market, getting a little pack of meat is like $25 now. Gas is extremely high now. Everything. I can't believe it's not butter. The big tub, I can't believe it's not butter. It's $10 now. How do we get to the point of poverty? Does it change depending on what's going on in our economy? Because so many people are struggling now financially, including myself.
Well, you're asking a really important question, Melanie. And I think that we've really got to look at this, unfortunately, in terms of the market and what's happening with workers. There's been an ongoing period of underemployment and unemployment, as well as suppressed wages. So I don't want to get into a deep history lesson, but I think that many folks know, and quite frankly, a lot of us are related to people who used to be in unions. I am related to folks who were sleeping car porter folks who worked on the rails, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So when there were unions and unionization, there was active advocacy for higher wages, for health benefits. Now with universal. We're looking at a global economy. And so if folks in the US don't want that job for a certain amount of money, we're going to offshore it to another country and they will do this kind of work for a lesser amount of money. So with globalization, you have certain jobs that are now shipped overseas, not done here. But the real issue is the cost of goods and the economic wherewithal of folks to actually access those goods. And so the actual level of poverty has remained the same. What's really happened is you don't have as many unions. And there is now an incentive, this notion that government doesn't do things well. So just like the post office, privatize it. There are these conversations around Social Security, privatize it. And the more that you put things in private hands, the more you're putting it into a market where the real math is around excessive profits for those who are very advantaged, and the folks who are in the middle just stay there. But they aren't really on in the middle anymore. They're, as you're saying, Melanie, they're barely getting by. So when you really start to look at the economics of it, and I don't mean to upset anyone, but we have an economy now. We're all talking about, I don't want to pick on any businesses, but I will talk about Amazon, just as an example. All of us, I think, love the idea that in 24 hours, just about anything that I want will appear at my doorstep. Well, Amazon workers aren't paid very well. They aren't unionized. Their benefits aren't great. It's a hard place to work. And so when you look at that in comparison to times past of the work life of folks who worked in fields, who worked in factories, child labor laws. I mean, you look at the actual uh, quality of work life. It of course changes and it's improved, but it is still not at a standard where I think a lot of workers don't feel that they are valued, that they are not economically valued, nor do they feel that they are valued as human beings. And you bring in COVID, you the whole issue of the great resignation with people leaving jobs because they felt as though they were asked to work too long for too few hours, that their family needs weren't recognized. And I think that it caused a number of people to think hard about their lives. That is having an impact. But unfortunately, once again, it's with people who are more advantaged, who had the luxury, quite frankly, of working from home. People who are bus drivers and who clean toilets and who, work at the grocery store, they were then considered essential. And I think that's really important to think of who are the folks considered essential, but a lot of those folks are at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Is there a difference between poverty and extreme poverty, or is there such a thing as poverty and extreme poverty?
There is a difference. There's a very difficult book to read. When I say difficult, it's not the text, it's just the topic. Kathy Eden has written a book called $2 a Day. And she talks about the people in America who live on $2 a day. There are folks who actually give blood plasma, who live in very substandard housing, who get the quality of life is very poor. But there is a large number of people in America who live in homes without running water, without heat, very difficult circumstances. And we don't really talk about this as a nation. When we look internationally, I think this sense of people without running water, this whole notion during COVID of washing your hands. How can you wash your hands if you don't have running water or clean running water? If you don't have heat, how are you going to deal with illnesses? And so there is a large number, millions of people, quite frankly, in America who live in extreme poverty circumstances. And I'm not talking about our brothers and sisters who are homeless, because we all know that people who experience housing security, and unfortunately, they're on the streets in Philly as they are all over the country, is an example of extreme poverty. Their families in extreme poverty, and unfortunately, more and more elders. It is a travesty for people in this city and others across the country to work as a bus driver or as a member of the working class, not be able to repair their home, but they pay their mortgage. And because I can't afford to replace my roof, for example, it starts to cave in, I can't live here anymore. And that's really a disgrace. There should be ways for people like that not to be homeless. And unfortunately, many of them are at this point in time.
What is the connection between poverty and opportunity?
Now, thank you. I was talking of, it's important for us to understand how important place is in poverty because where you live, residential segregation has segregated a lot of the haves from the have-nots. A lot of the haves live in communities where parents and social circles will put you in a place where job opportunities, fine educations, because tax dollars in some communities are supporting that. That's a place of opportunity. People who don't necessarily live in those communities don't know of those opportunities. And there are two real problems here. One is the knowledge of. And so, if you were in a community, and all of us are in community with people, we know people who have jobs. But for us, a lot of it is we only know what we know of. So if I know someone who works at the post office, who works at the store, who works at H&R Block, who is a school teacher, my view is based around what I know. I don't know many people who are astrophysicists, who are chemical engineers, who are neurosurgeons, and some things are just unknown to me. Their lifestyle, what they do, how one gets there, what that is about, totally out of my view. So there are real segregations as we raise children, as we as adults think about jobs or fields or areas we might apply and go into. And because of residential segregation and poverty, our networks are different. Most of
Mhm.
us tend to network and socialize with folks who are kind of like us. We go to church with them, we socialize with them, we may see them at a community center, at a social event. Without those kinds of connections, how a lot of us get jobs, how a lot of us take our children along, and our children then want to say, Miss Melany, can you please tell me about your TV show and how I do that? And that is how people, kind of see role models and begin to understand paths. If you don't have those kinds of links, how would you ever know to ask? How would you ever see that as being a possibility for yourself?
So that could be the difference from an Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan,
Mhm.
as opposed to that young man who can ball really well, you know what I mean, in a poor section of Philadelphia or somewhere else,
Mhm.
or someone else who is awesome, like an Oprah Winfrey, but will never get recognized.
100%. And see, part of this, as you talk about the recognition, the more and more that we depend upon the media, where are the people who look like us who are in a variety of different jobs? There are all kinds of careers, but one doesn't know of them if you don't see them. And so
Mhm.
a lot of people they go to places. I see someone who looks like me who has that job, and it says, maybe one day I could do that because I see them in that position. I think we all may have seen that very powerful photograph of President Obama with the young man, and the young man asked him, can I touch your hair? Because you look like me. You look like me. You look like you have hair like mine. And if you could be president, then maybe it means that somebody with my skin color and hair texture could also be president. And that's a powerful thing for a child.
You spoke about generational poverty. How does that affect children? And do they become stuck
Yeah.
in what they saw their parents or grandparents do?
Well, this is a deep question, Melanie, and perhaps something that we need much more time to talk about. But part of it is we know, and my background in psychology talks about this whole notion of um, first of all, look at role models. What we see around us begins to define us as being normal. And so, growing up in an environment where there is persistent poverty, persistent violence, a real lack and scarcity tells me that I am less than.
Mm,
Children are not immune and to they see things just like we see them. And so when I'm on the ball team, baseball, football, basketball, hockey, soccer, doesn't really matter, and I go to compete with other schools, I have an idea of what their school looks like. And I look at their neighborhood as I'm sitting there on the bus. It says something about why am I living here and why are they living there? And so it's a notion that I am less than. We have gotten to the point as a nation with some communities with poverty where we're really saying you don't matter. You live in substandard conditions, you have substandard facilities. This begins to eat into your psyche. And it's
mm,
something that a lot of us are not aware of. But we are told as a society who matters. And mattering is both a sense of being valued and adding value. This comes from the work of Dr. Isaac Pilotinsky. In American society, we do not act as though certain communities matter. And we certainly don't act as though people who are impoverished matter. So this is I don't need to say this to a child. I mean, some people do say to children, you don't matter. But without saying that, I've already said it just by everything that's around them because they see pristine homes and lawns and ball fields and schools and opportunities here and substandard housing and a sense of scarcity and a depravity of spirit, quite frankly. So it's not only poverty from a financial poverty, but I think the deepest poverty is the poverty of spirit. Because
mm,
I feel that I am not worthy, that I do not matter, I am putting myself in a less than situation. And
mm,
it's a self fulfilling prophecy. Then I become less than. This is something I do to myself. And unfortunately, we live in a country that does not see the inherent dignity and value of all people people who are disabled, people of color, people who may not be English speaking, people who are immigrants. And you see a lot of these populations overrepresented in the poverty statistics. And I believe that part of that is intentional. These are messages that have been given to people as we talk about historically going back to the founding of this country. And now we're in a point where there is a lot of consternation about who matters in America and if an equity framework is something that this country really can live up to. Dr. Vincent Harding used to ask the question, is America possible? Is it really possible for me to see the value in my brothers and sisters?
and what you're saying is so powerful. Now, the show here, The Power of One, is Melany, not associated with any job, any employment. But I will speak about something that happened to me when I was at one of my jobs. There was this young lady who was being interviewed, and she was no more than 6 years old. And the question was asked, what are some of the rules that you have to follow in your house? And she said what those rules were. And then this person says to her, well, what happens if you do not follow those rules? The young lady was German, I think. I think they were German. And she said, what happens if you do not follow those rules? This little 6-year-old girl said, my parents told me that they would send me to a Black family.
Mm,
I was floored.
yeah,
And then this little 6-year-old says, I don't want to go to a Black family.
yeah.
I was just, I was sitting there, and this happened in 2023.
Mhm,
And I'm like, you're raising this little young child to be racist. That hurt
mhm,
me to my heart.
mhm.
I, how are we still here?
Well, I agree with you 100%, Melanie. I think that it is the beauty of our people and a number of historically marginalized community that tell a story of beauty and of power and of intelligence and of brilliance and of sustaining ourselves. And this is one of the challenges we're having now of can we really have an authentic and honest conversation about the history of this nation and who these people are? Because how the story is told and who tells the story makes a huge amount of difference.
Mm,
Um, Part of what you're talking about now, too, it also brings back the earlier question about intergenerational, is this whole notion of historical trauma. And a number of psychologists are doing research. A lot of this is very interesting, come out of Holocaust victims, saying folks who were related to people in the Holocaust were traumatized, of course, by the Holocaust. The Holocaust was real for any of your listeners who don't believe it was real. Millions of Jews were killed. And that historical fact, quite frankly, was based on, if you read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, the way that Black people were treated in America. The Nazis from Germany came to America to be skilled and schooled on how one oppresses people. And that kind of historical trauma is within our blood, it's within our bones, it's within our history. And as you're saying, we're passing that on to our children in the way that we raise them. So this is a deep and very
mhm.
painful reality. That again, I think is another conversation for another show, because this fact, and it really is a fact, is part of how we have unfortunately begun to see ourselves. But a lot of the issue, and I'm not blaming Black people as people at all, they're protective ways that we learned to protect ourselves and our children from harm. You know, when the slave master says, "Oh, your daughter over there, she's looking pretty good," and your response is, "Oh, she ain't nothing. She's ugly. She's stupid. I'm
Mhm.
doing everything I can because I don't want the slave master to pay attention to my 12-year-old child over here. This is a problem." But
Right.
we learned that, and how many times do we hear, "Oh, she ain't nothing. She don't know nothing. She's stupid. She's never gonna amount to nothing." And I understand exactly where it's coming from.
Mm,
Um,
yeah, and it's hurtful. But I do want to thank you so much for having this hard conversation with me, Dr. Robinson. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to having an opportunity to talk to you again one day.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, we had a very hard conversation, but I want everyone who is listening to know if you're living in poverty, you are special, you are unique, and you are someone. Don't let someone belittle you because of the materialistic things that you have or some of the things that you do not have. You are loved. And don't let someone belittle you because of the color of your skin. Remember, the power of one starts with you. Peace and love.